Hi, folks. This is Rich Palazzo again from thinkingaccurately.education.com. And as you probably know, we're reading through our book, The Bible, Christianity, and American Government. And today we're going to read the third chapter, God's Plan for Self-Government. All right, so let's get started. Genesis 3 details the historical account of the fall of Adam and Eve and how they were turned out of paradise. That's the Garden of Eden. Adam became a farmer, and later in Genesis 5:28 through 29, we see that Adam's descendants, the children of his son Seth, even hundreds of years later, they were still farmers. Each man was commanded in Genesis 2:24 to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. So each family was to establish a new independent household, just as people do today. Think of Little House on the Prairie or the 1991 movie Sarah Plain and Tall. Imagine homesteads spread out from each other, several hours or perhaps a day's travel, but not totally isolated from each other. Though always honoring their parents, the new couple would no longer be subject to them. I looked up the word subject in Webster's 1828 dictionary, and it says it means being under the power and dominion of another. In taking on the responsibilities of managing this new independent household, they became, for all intents and purposes, their parents' equals. It became the man's responsibility to provide for and build a home for his wife and their children. The wife was his companion and helpmate. See Genesis 2:18. The husband, father, answered directly to God and was directly responsible to him for how he lived, how he treated his wife, and they were both responsible for how they raised their children. They were to owe no man anything, and they were totally free to enjoy their God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each family tilled their own land, tended their own field, garden, and orchard, though they were also free to pursue their individual gifts and talents. One man, for example, who lived by a stream, might build and operate a mill. Another person might choose to operate a loom or a forge. But if a miller or a weaver or a smith did not do the work that he promised his customers he would do, his customers had no government to go to for satisfaction. Business dealings in those days were done by covenant, an agreement between two parties that was considered to be enforced when necessary by God himself. Thomas Jefferson once wrote in his 1787 Notes on the State of Virginia, he said, "Those who labor on the earth are the chosen people of God, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." That well describes the culture of the early patriarchs. But it wasn't easy to be a farmer. You had to get up early in the morning to begin a long day of work, and you had many responsibilities. If you don't milk the cow, it will stop giving milk. If you don't feed the chickens, they will stop laying eggs. If you don't plant your crops, you will have no harvest. In short, if you don't work, you won't eat. And if you're a day's travel from your neighbor's house, you have to learn how to do a lot of things yourself. Think of that Mel Gibson movie from 1984, one of my wife's favorites, The River. If your roof leaks, you learn to mend it yourself. If your equipment needs repair, you learn to repair it yourself. In other words, you become self-reliant. See Proverbs chapter 6, verse 11. Many of Seth's descendants were the kind of people that Jefferson would later say possessed substantial and genuine virtue. Yet at the same time, another culture also existed, the descendants of Adam's other son, Cain, which began with the building of the first city. See Genesis 4:16 through 17. Contrast their lifestyle to that of Seth's farming community. If your roof leaks, you call a landlord. If something needs to be replaced, you take it to the repairman. If your tools need to be sharpened, you go to the hardware store. If you need bread, you buy it at the bakery. In other words, you become dependent. In his same notes on the state of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition." And in the Bible, we find this in Psalm 55, verse 9. It says, "For I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around on its walls. Iniquity and trouble are also in the midst of it." But Seth's descendants looked at the glitter of urban life, the beautiful starlets, the famous personalities, and they traded away what they now saw as simple, unsophisticated farms. But at what cost? They chose not to see the difference in values of the culture they were becoming part of. One of Cain's descendants said this, admiring and wanting to imitate his famous ancestor. This is in Genesis 4:23 through 24. He says, "I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold." Even though Cain had murdered his own brother, his descendants still thought of him as a great man and tried to follow in his footsteps. And Seth's descendants closed their eyes to the violence and strife, and closed their ears to the cries of the oppressed, even though they knew it was wrong. And when the great flood came, both cultures were destroyed, except for 8 people, the family of Noah. And after the flood, even Noah went back to farming. However, the people, Noah's descendants, eventually began to build a city known as Babel. William Penn, a wise man and the founder of the state of Pennsylvania, once said, "Those people who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants." And the Bible, in Genesis 10, verses 8 through 12, tells us about the world's first tyrant. His name was Nimrod. Why do you think that the Bible tells us that Nimrod was a mighty hunter? What do you think that has to do with his rise to power? In any case, he was what the King James Version of the Bible calls a man of renown. See Genesis 6, verse 4. And the Bible quotes Jesus as saying something about men of renown. This is from Luke 22:25. "The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors." Here's a quote from John Locke a famous English philosopher who is often called the father of liberalism. This is from his second treatise of government, dated 1689. He wrote, "A man may owe honor and respect to an ancient or wise man, and gratitude to a benefactor, but all these give no authority, no right to anyone of making laws over him from whom they are owing." It sounds like Locke was agreeing with Jesus' criticism of the great men of his time. And later, Alexis de Tocqueville, you know that we've quoted from him before, he gave this warning to his friends in America. This is from his book called Democracy in America, dated 1840. "It would seem," he wrote, "that if despotism were to be established among the democratic nations of our days, it might assume a different character. It would be more extensive and more mild. It would degrade men without tormenting them." I'm thinking here of the Nazis. I'm thinking of Stalin when de Tocqueville uses the word torment. That's the image that comes into my mind. I looked up the word despotism on Bing, and it says the definition is the exercise of absolute power, especially in a cruel and oppressive way. So a despot would be a dictator. Remember that de Tocqueville was a Frenchman, and he was writing in the 1800s. He went on to write in the Democracy of America. He said this: "It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of their property, and subdivides their inheritance. What remains," he wrote, to spare them of all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living." Thus, the authority, the government, in that kind of situation, renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for all these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and to often look on them as benefits. After having thus successfully taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp and fashioned him at will, the supreme power, the government, what's his name? We had talked about Thomas Hobbes, and he called it the Leviathan, remember? De Tocqueville is kind of alluding to the same thing. He calls it the supreme power. Anyway, then the supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. The will of men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government becomes the shepherd. The Bible says this: wisdom is better than strength, and words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war. That's from Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 16 through 18. And it says in James 3:17, the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. What can we do to gain such wisdom as this? Well, one thing we can do is listen to the words of those who have gone before us, and we can learn from their experience. You know, maybe Thomas Jefferson and Alexis Tocqueville and William Penn have something that they can teach us, even us, in the 21st century. I just want to remind you folks that this is thinkingaccurately.education.com. We have a blog and we have a podcast, and you might want to listen to this YouTube video again because these quotes are a little hard to absorb unless you're reading them. But anyway, thank you for listening. Have a great day. Take good care of yourself. Bye now.